Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven were not only collaborative professors in political science and sociology, they were husband and wife. Professor Piven is still living at the age of 91, but her husband, Richard Cloward, passed away in 2001. At this point, in 2024, what is probably their most effective work together is hardly known or discussed. It's playing out before our eyes, though, in many forums and in many political arenas, and understanding their ideas at this point is paramount to the preservation of freedom. In 1966, Cloward and Piven published an essay called The Weight of the Poor, a Strategy to End Poverty. This was their primary focus and passion, especially for Frances. She was an activist, a socialist, and a Marxist who sought to utilize whatever means necessary to create the most equitable, classless utopia, just as Karl Marx had always dreamed. So it's important I preface all of this by saying that their strategy was meant to eliminate poverty. But it's this very framework and strategy being applied elsewhere today. So this is what they wrote in 1966 about eliminating poverty. It is our purpose to advance a strategy which affords the basis for a convergence of civil rights organizations, militant anti-poverty groups, and the poor. If this strategy were implemented, a political crisis would result that could lead to legislation for a guaranteed annual income and thus an end to poverty. Let's just take this first statement in reverse. They suggested using the government and the legislative branch to eradicate poverty. In other words, a system of the government to address poverty, which is basically the welfare system, but not quite. They said this would be achieved by a political crisis, and that the crisis would somehow be caused by a convergence or a combining of forces of three groups: the poor, militant groups or violent, destructive groups, and civil rights organizations, which at that time was only referring to black civil rights groups. And you have to remember that this was just 2 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. In summary, their opening argument here was instigating poor, black, violent people and others associated to create crisis so awful that the government would have no choice but to act. Okay? Now, the strategy evolves a bit. They wrote, "The force for that challenge and the strategy we propose is a massive drive to recruit the poor onto the welfare rolls." It's important to remember the key component of crisis in Cloward and Piven's strategy, okay? Crisis. Here, they're suggesting as a treatment of poverty to get as many people on the welfare system as possible, that this would create the political and social crisis necessary for revolution, an intentional flooding of the system, if you will. But the strategy doesn't merely employ a contrived crisis, it capitalizes on genuine crises, like an economic crisis, for example. They wrote, "The legislative reforms of the Depression years, for example, were impelled not so much by organized interests, exercised through regular electoral processes, as by widespread economic crisis. The Great Depression was an economic collapse which created a mass economic crisis in the US, also known as poverty. So what happened? The New Deal happened. Government programs were created. The federal government was massively expanded. It launched the welfare state, which is why Cloward and Piven are citing it in their explanation. The problem for revolutionists is, though, in America, we have a constitutional democratic republic. The opportunity for socio-political revolution is slim to none outside of crisis, without the full support and help of one of the major political parties, if not both. Not to worry, though, because Cloward and Piven had this all figured out in the 1960s. They said, "In the face of such a crisis, urban political leaders may well be paralyzed by a party apparatus. The national Democratic leadership, however, is alert to the importance of the urban Negro vote. Indeed, many of the legislative reforms of the Great Society can be understood as efforts, however feeble, to reinforce the allegiance of growing ghetto constituencies to the National Democratic Administration. So the revised version of the Democratic Party after the realignments of 1932 emerged as a vessel for revolutionary change in America. FDR empowered the federal government through the New Deal, and following in his footsteps, Lyndon B. Johnson did the same with the Great Society in the 1960s. More government. Government is the solution to all problems. Expand, bloat, throw money in government expansion at the problems. And who would become the political pawns of this movement but the blacks in America? Now hang on to that. A couple years later, in '68, Cloward and Piven wrote, "Poor people win mainly when they mobilize in disruptive protests. By disruptive protests, we mean acts such as incendiarism, riots, sit-ins, and other forms of civil disobedience, great surges in demands for relief benefits." Here you have a more detailed list of the violent, forceful mob mentality that Cloward and Piven encouraged for the sake of political revolution and change. Disruptive protests, incendiarism, which is fires, bombings, etc., riots, and these are coupled with non-violent disruptive protests like sit-ins, civil disobedience, surges in demand, etc. For what reason? What would doing these things accomplish? Well, they said, mass disruption, both its emergence and its successes, is closely related to electoral politics. When a regime is insecure, it is more likely to bargain actively for support. Social movements thrive on conflict. Okay, so stop right there just a second. Barack Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, in 2008, infamously said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." Now, where do you think he learned that? Cloward and Piven said, social movements thrive on conflict. Movements have the impact they do on electoral politics, mainly because the issues they raise and the strife they generate widen cleavages among voter groups. So you have a crisis or a conflict, and revolutionaries, or you could call them Marxists, exploit the conflict to cause a defection in electoral politics. They called this dissensus politics. Dissensus politics, as opposed to consensus politics. Revolutionary change is not accomplished through a unified system, but a divided one. So we're going to talk about today's examples, but let's just think back to 4 years ago. Mark Levin wrote this: "This strategy has also largely played out in America's streets and politics as Antifa, BLM, and other Marxist anarchist groups exploited both the initial economic collapse due to the coronavirus and the death of George Floyd." Now, just retrace the steps we're taking here. The death of George Floyd was a racial crisis. The coronavirus pandemic was a health crisis. Both of these things caused economic crisis. So once again, you have these revolutionary mobs carrying out riotous, incendiary acts, exploiting dissensus politics, co-opting the Democrat Party to enact a revolution in the United States. Which major party was fully supportive of these groups? Which party was it that never once condemned their destructive rampage? On that note, the design of the American government is a massive hindrance to revolution. Even the minority power retains some form of power, and there are 3 branches of the federal government, and the states have individual power. Crises don't happen often enough or regularly enough to accomplish the extent of revolutionary change the Marxists are after. So what can we do to address that? Well, keep in mind this idea of the census politics and this age-old idea that we stand united but we fall divided. Cloward and Piven wrote, "Social movements, even movements that are not particularly disruptive, can do what party leaders and contenders for office in a two-party system will not do. They can raise deeply divisive issues. In fact, social movements thrive on drama and urgency and solidarity that result from raising divisive issues." So, what are the social movements of our day? What are the divisive issues of our time? In 2024, have you noticed the exponential rate at which divisive issues have risen in the present age? Racial movements continue. Sexual movements have exploded. Climate movements have erupted. You're witnessing a blatant attempt at a revolution. But for what reason? A Marxist utopia where everyone owns nothing and everybody has an equal slice of the American pie? No, of course not. Evil men throughout the last 2 centuries have enacted the plans of Marxist communism to oppress populations and enrich themselves. Every single time, Marxism creates dystopia, the opposite of expectation, and this is directly attributable to the inherent evil of man. Just ask the Chinese, ask the Cubans, ask the Cambodians, ask the Romanians, ask the Ukrainians. Marx's bloody footprints are all throughout the last 200 years. You ask, well, Blake, who is it that wants to radically transform America? Well, just 5 days before Election Day in 2008, Barack Obama said, quote, "We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America." And indeed, he was correct. Federal spending skyrocketed. Obama legislated from the Oval Office like a dictator. From his office, outside of the legislative branch, he issued his dictates on amnesty, gay marriage, guns, private business, etc. His scandals were all subterranean. Nobody talks about them, and hidden from the public thanks to our stellar media and press. Benghazi, the weaponizing of the IRS and the NSA, though he could speak in eloquent words and form coherent sentences, unlike his vice president and the current president, Obama was the first in modern history to demonize political opponents and attack them on many fronts. Remember, the key is dissensus, not consensus. Racial tensions hit a decades-long high with Obama in office, a fever pitch of racial animosity stoked by a commander-in-chief. All of this to say, we clearly have leadership in America who seek a new revolution in America, a new American revolution. President Biden is effectively a third Obama term, though he's surprisingly more radical than his old boss. Consider the social movements he's championed. Consider his recent State of the Union address. But what about outside of America? There are undoubtedly foreign billionaires and enemy regimes that seek to revolutionize America to its own destruction. And for what other purpose than globalism? Consider America in April of 2024. Our government is massively overspending at such a colossal rate that it's economically unsustainable. It will lead to economic crisis that will, without question, rival the economic wasteland of the 1930s and the Great Depression. The US dollar will lose its value rapidly over a shorter period of time, at which point it loses its place as the world's reserve currency. So the dollar is done, and this massive global economic crisis sets the stage for monetary revolution. A new currency, probably a digital one, which can easily be controlled and manipulated. I think this largely explains what's happening with Russia right now. It explains in part what's happening with China right now. But that's a conversation for a different day. We have a faith crisis in America where Christianity is no longer the religion of the land. We have a new religion, and it's liberalism. That's the revolution there. This should have been abundantly clear to you all on Easter, when Easter had to share the American calendar with the Transgender Day of Visibility, which we'll talk about more next week. We have an immigration crisis on our southern and even our northern borders. This administration refuses to enforce border and customs laws, rules, and regulations. Millions have entered either illegally or under the guise of asylum and are being flown and bussed around the United States. These are not Americans, but our sitting president says they are. And what social political opportunity is this creating? It's changing our electorate. It's changing the governmental composition. It's creating anarchy. It's endangering lives. It's creating more economic instability. It could be an economic time bomb. It could very well be the implantation of militaristic invaders, and it may surely be used to consolidate political power. A whole host of crises there. In a more abstract way, it's weakening the American identity, because all this runs parallel to the assaults on patriotism. And all of this, just a manufactured crisis for the purpose of fundamental transformation and revolution on a global scale. And what about this climactic crescendo of the sexual revolution? This crisis of gender and sexuality and personal identity, which is almost uniquely American. It's destroying men and women, boys and girls, and most importantly, the family, which is the bedrock of civilization. In similar fashion to how Democrats treated blacks in the 60s and made lofty promises of change and revolution, there is no plan to fix anything, because the plan today is to destroy everything. Now, if I'm correct in my analysis of all this history and academic literature and the current social, economic, religious, political, global situation, the revolutionaries would, of course, not want you to know any of this, which is why I think Wikipedia just recently removed the opening paragraphs of an article defining the Cloward Piven strategy. Here's what the site used to read. The Cloward Piven strategy is a political strategy outlined in 1966 by American sociologists and political activists Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven. It is the strategy of forcing political change leading to societal collapse through orchestrated crises. The Cloward Piven strategy seeks to hasten the fall of capitalism by overloading the government bureaucracy with a flood of impossible demands, amassing massive unpayable national debt, and other methods such as unfettered immigration, thus pushing society into crisis and economic collapse by overwhelming the United States. Now, that second paragraph is misleading, and you should know that by now after all that I've just explained to you, but what the paragraph suggests is correct. No, Cloward and Piven never wrote anything on destroying capitalism, but their philosophical forefather, Karl Marx, certainly did. Cloward and Piven never wrote anything about national debt or immigration, but you do see the framework for their strategy from 1966 playing out before you to push the American society into crisis and economic collapse, and overwhelming of the United States. Just remember the prophetic writings of George Orwell from 1984. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless endless present in which the party is always right. James Lindsay is an author and academic here in America and from East Tennessee. Here's how he explained it on Joe Rogan's podcast.
The Cloward Piven strategy, I'm sure you've heard of that. Somebody's got to have talked to you about the Cloward Piven.
Can you explain it?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. The idea is that you take advantage of a system in the way that it's set up so that you overwhelm it. In particular, in this case, you're going to overwhelm social services. You're going to overwhelm, border enforcement. You're going to overwhelm whatever they're doing in the cities. It's like tens of thousands of dollars per taxpayer or whatever per year going to dealing with what they're calling the migrant crisis. So you try to overwhelm the system in order to basically collapse it so that you can create a crisis, and the crisis creates the excuse to bring in new policies. Oh, well, maybe what we need is, what do they call it, E-Verify or something? So we need a digital system where we can track who everybody is, but then they get their digital system and then you're off to the races. But yeah, this is an old strategy, well documented.
In 1968, the Beatles released a song titled Revolution, in which John Lennon sang, "You say you want a revolution. Well, we all want to change the world, but when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out?" If there's any revolution that's going to happen, it's removing these Marxists, revolutionists, and globalists from our leadership in our American institutions of government and education and religion. The real revolution is coming to the tyrants who want to watch the world burn while they stuff their pockets and laugh at our demise. If it's not that, you can count us out. Thanks for watching this clip. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it. So do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we would love for you to go check out wethefreeshow.com to grab yourself some merch to spread the word of We the Free. And we're also going to put a video on the screen right now that we think that you'll like. Now, go and be that salt and light, and we'll see you next time.